All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to Module 9 of the Caribbean Coaching Certification Program. Tonight, our facilitator is Ms. Shammah Philgence. She is a teacher at the Corinth Secondary, not Corinth, Bocage
Okay.
Secondary School, um, working primarily with physical education. She coaches swimming, both in the pool, and she's had some open water coaching training experience. She's both an athlete and a coach in the pole vaulting program, and is an avid netballer and in a netball club as well, and volleyball as well. So she's seen a vast array of sports, especially the junior levels around St. Lucia in the recent years. She came through the CCCP in our first set of groups in November 2019, and has been a part of our training group as we've developed since then. So with that, I'll hand over to Shammah Philgence. I've got everybody on mute right now. If you have any questions throughout the session, you can raise your hand. I'll be moderating that aspect of things in terms of letting people get in a chance to contribute. You should have your workbooks that you can have either on your screen or in hard copy next to you. We will be addressing all the questions in the workbook throughout this session. So after the session, you should be able to submit those in to me at the SLOC for review before our next module. So everyone's up to par on that. So yeah, with that, I will hand over to Shammah Philgence with Sport for Persons with a Disability.
Welcome, everybody. Um, I think Andy pretty much covered everything about me. Um, we are going to start a very interesting and I think left out section of sports, which is sports for persons with a disability. And I can pretty much assure or guarantee that 1 out of the 5 or 10 persons in here has come across a person with a disability and had to include them in their activities. So I'm hoping that this makes it a little more easy for you to maneuver normal persons as well as persons with disabilities. I will not be reading through every slide because you can read them. If you have any questions, you can feel free to ask. So, Unit 1, working with athletes with a disability. What are athletes with disabilities? Or who are athletes with disabilities and what are their disabilities? Athletes with disabilities are persons with a wide range of disabilities who compete in sport. Athletes with both intellectual disabilities as well as physical impairments. Athletes compete at the highest level, such as the Paralympics, which is kind of interesting since we have persons here participating in the Paralympics. So we're going to go into the first topic for athletes with disabilities, which is the intellectual athletes. And those persons are ID'd as persons with limitations in intellectual function below 70. So the IQ is below 17. Difficulty in communication, looking after their health and safety, dealing with social interactions, learning difficulties, academic in particular. So we're going to jump right into the next topic, which is autism. Autism, a complex development disability typically appearing during first 3 years of life, result of a neurological disorder which affects brain function. One of the more trickier athletes to deal with because of their disability. I've had the I've actually had the privilege of working with one person like that, and everything is a lot different. They overheat faster than normal persons would do. They are overzealous, so you have to tend to, pull back and reduce for them because they will not do it. But they're fun to work with. So, any questions? Good. Any questions? So we're going to the next division, which is athletes with physical disabilities, which is pretty much straightforward. Persons with locomotor disabilities or sensory impairments. Major groups with sensory impairments are those who are blind or have visual impairment. And for us in the Caribbean, or especially St. Lucia, we have blind cricket, where the ball has a bell in it so that they are able to hear the ball come in and also find the ball when it's rolling away. Major groups of locomotor impairment would include amputees, spinal cord injuries, cerebral palsy, and lis otus, right? So, amputees are still persons who can participate in a lot of sports, which a lot of people don't realize, but I actually know a netballer who has one hand, functional hand. So she would be a right hand amputee, I think it is. But moving along. General tips or fun facts. Athletes with disabilities, athlete with a disability is an athlete first. Your role as a coach is to remove the barriers to the athlete's participation. Focus on what they can do and not on what they cannot do. Refer to disability only when relevant. Make no assumptions, which is something I mentioned earlier with the young lady with autism that I had to work with. I assumed that she was able to run about like the kids that I had. We had what 7 to 11 year olds, but I did not take into consideration that her body functions a little differently, and so she overheated a lot faster than the kids that we had. So right here, it highlights not making any assumptions. You ask any and every question that comes to mind. Most of you will have a gut feeling, and you should go with it. If you feel like, hey, this is too much, you do that, because it is very, very important when you're working with athletes with disabilities that you do not push them too far. Remote skill development. Remote skill development is part of, I think, the most important part of this development, because it requires that you focus on one particular aspect. You break it down so that they can get it. You have to break it down as simple as possible, and that is where a lot of people tend to evade, assuming that it's too simple for them. And nothing is ever too simple. When the athlete has done it, then you can determine whether or not it's too simple. If you need to ask away. So we're off to athletes with impaired hearing. Basic things to work with athletes with impaired hearing. Do not shout, they won't hear you. Stand in front of them so that they can read your lips. Normally, you could stand on the sidelines and gesture or shout what it is that you want to do. You have to make a special effort to ensure that you're in front of the person. Make instructions visible where possible. Get permission before touching tactile feedback. Carry a pad and pencil for writing instructions or comments or feedback, which makes life a lot easier, which is something we could actually do with all athletes because most persons learn differently. But with them, this is actually like an A plus plus for them because you get to spend more time in the execution of whatever it is that you want done rather than having issues in communication. Athletes with impaired vision. Well, the obvious, there's no need to shout. Speak directly to the person, which means you use their names. They have impaired vision means that they're not either not able to see properly or they can't see at all. So gesticulating things just won't work out. Encourage the person to take your arm. Let the person know you are approaching them or in their presence, as it would be obvious because they cannot see you. You need to be you need to alert them. You don't want to startle them. You don't want them running into you. So you must always announce yourself before, introduce if anybody else is there, and don't change the environment in which they are accustomed to because these persons, these athletes, learn differently to all of us. They focus more on learning the zone, how it's set up, the distance between the back lines or the sidelines. If you're playing football, they know exactly how far it is, so you do not want to move anything and cause an issue. Okay. Develop a very clear, audible signal that signals stop. Why does anybody know why that is one of the most important things for an athlete with impaired vision? Anybody?
Mark has his hand raised. Go ahead, Mark. Yeah, so I think it's important to have really clear signals in general, but especially when it comes to the areas of like stopping action, because everyone needs to be on the same page, and that signal needs to be, whether it's audible or even visual, I guess, but it needs to be universally available to everybody and very, very clear within the activity. And I think from my own coaching, what I've seen is the only time we've ever really had injuries, especially with younger kids, is when they're in a certain spot of the drill or of the practice that they're not supposed to be, and and before word can get to them that they need to settle down and literally stop, it just doesn't get there. And so having those standards up front that can pause the situation before it gets worse is going to be really, really helpful, I think, to reducing injuries with any kid, let alone athletes with any disabilities at all.
Perfectly said. I could not have said it better myself.
All right.
Thank you, Mark.
Yep, thank you, Mark. And for everybody involved here, I think the last few slides that we've gone over and discussed would be very relevant to Task 9A in your workbooks. So if we take a look at that, Shammah, I think we've talked about a number of ways that we can make athletes feel more welcome. So we talk about welcoming them to the practice, in a lot of ways treating them just like we would any other athlete, focusing on what they can do, promoting and developing the skills that they do have. So we're not going to set unreasonable expectations for athletes on areas that they can't control, but look at what they can do. As we start again here, talk about removing barriers, whether that's physical barriers or other barriers that's going to impede their performance or ability to perform. Offering assistance, speaking directly to them, and also how we as coaches position ourselves to be able to communicate one way or another and what those methods of communication are. Those are all a few ways that we've identified so far to be able to make an athlete with a disability feel welcome at a training session or at a sports event like that. So I would encourage everybody, please, you should be able from the discussion so far to get 7 to 8 items down that can illustrate different ways that we can adapt our practice or our actions as coaches to make those athletes feel more comfortable. All right, so Shammah, I'll kick it back to you here. I know some things we should be looking out for as well is ways to ensure that the athletes are safe within their practices, that the athletes with disabilities are safe during practices. And let's also keep an eye out for any modifications and drills that we might be able to offer for athletes with disabilities.
That being said, we actually said one earlier where we said do not change the environment. That would be one of the pointers that should be down. One of the questions stated.
Okay, yeah, so probably like in terms of safety. So if we're looking at items that might be on the ground or anywhere in the environment, but those athletes are going to remember it in a very specific space, and we need to remember that if that changes, it's going to be a hazard to them because they're not going to know that it's necessarily changed depending on the disability.
Okay. We're moving on to athletes who use wheelchairs. You need to ask before touching the wheelchair. You know how a lot of people, when you get into the vehicle, they don't want you to touch the radio? Same thing applies here. Ask before. It's their own personal space. Sometimes they don't want just anyone touching their stuff. Do not lean or prop anything on the wheelchair. If you put anything that the athlete's not accustomed to, you are looking for an incident. So keep the wheelchair as free as it comes, because you don't know how it will affect the mobility of the person if they don't know how to use whatever is on there, or if it just disturbs their whole psyche. All right. Speak directly to the athlete and, if possible, get down to their level. Why get down to their level? Because it does not seem that you're speaking at them. You're speaking to them when you get down to their level. Beware of the person's ability, since they may be able to walk with aid. So, like the first slide we went over said, do not assume, ask a question. If you're new with the athletes, ask a question. Always ask a question. Even though they've been your athletes for a little bit, you never know what can change. So you must always ask, just in case. And that, ladies and gentlemen, ends our Unit 1. We're moving over to Unit 2, which is safety. It's something you hear a lot these days over the radio, over the TV, a lot of campaigns going on. Safety for athletes. So Unit 2 is safety and medical considerations. So, like I said, with the very first example I gave with the autistic young lady, her safety measure in that case would have been to ensure that she took water breaks a lot sooner and a lot more than the other athletes. But on a general note, The same conditions applies with them. Care, prevention, and management of injuries. Please ensure that your athletes warm up, cool down, and stretch. Have be able and ensure that first aid is present and overuse of injuries. Overuse of injuries is something that's common in every sporting discipline across the board because an athlete may complain of a shoulder injury and we tell them it's okay, go to the doctor, or sometimes they don't even tell you that they're injured and they come back to play. It is imperative that you ensure that the injuries get treated. Safe and appropriate exercises. You have to get exercises to meet the disability. You can't give a child with cerebral palsy the same exercise that you would give someone with an impaired disability. Protective equipment, helmets if needed. Nutrition and fluid replacement. Like I said from the get go, fluids are more important, especially during training. Nutrition is extremely important. I cannot stress how important that is. So, safety considerations. Before working with any athlete with a disability, it is wise to have the athlete and the parent or guardian, if the athlete is a minor, meet with his or her doctor or medical team to get from them any recommendations concerning athlete-specific activities, restrictions, or instructions for the coach. They are the expert on what the athlete can do. So, like I said, always get your questions in and answered. Athletes with spinal cord injury, more on the interesting side. Ensure athletes are properly strapped in if needed in their chair or whatever it is that they're in. Check straps and foot support regularly because it's not a normal thing, but it's something that you should make normal in your checkups. Ask athletes if they have the ability to regulate their body temperature, which it's not common for a lot of normal athletes, but a lot of people, there are some people in the 1% of the world who cannot sweat, so they need assistance to sweat. The athletes with disabilities, they're along the same line sometimes. Thermal protection for the lower body and back, buttocks, and upper legs. Prevent pressure areas, sores, and areas of constant contact. So it basically speaks for itself. Anybody has questions? Yeah.
I don't
Okay.
see any questions up right now, but I think that's a good as we kind of end that second unit right there. Yeah, that's a great spot for us to maybe just review some of the key ways to ensure the athlete's safety. So, we talked about safe and appropriate exercises, proper replacement of fluids, meeting with medical teams, so that's parents, the medical care providers, to ensure that before the activity, what the necessities are going to be to make that successful and safe. We talked earlier about removing any barriers that might be, a hazard, first aid kits, and again, how we just approach the environment and how we approach our athletes are a few other ideas there that we could use for that second task on 9B.
As well as overuse of injuries.
Yep, overuse injuries. So making sure that the workload or the play load, as it might be, doesn't get so great that we end up in a position where they lose control of what they're able to do, and we end up in a situation. So yes, I think for everybody participating. As you go back and you look at 9B, you can definitely reference these slides here and this aspect of the discussion. If you haven't captured everything in your notes in the last section here. And I think we can go on to Unit 3, which I suspect is going to have a lot of relevance to the 9C task in our workbook. So you can follow along with that as we go through here and have some discussion on adaptation.
Okay. Strategies for adaptation. Making inclusion happen. It is a very simple process. However, it's something that we need to ensure that happens, especially if you plan on mixing the two types of athletes. So, strategies. Inclusion planning works best as a team effort. Nothing you put down on paper can work unless your team is on the same page. So you gotta share, and you don't dictate. Promote shared ownership and responsibility from the start. Ensure all individuals have access. Always focus on the ability of the athlete and plan with these in mind rather than focusing on their disability. So, for the amputee, the netballer, right? Instead of focusing on the fact that she's an amputee, you would focus on developing her ability to manage the ball in the hand that can hold it, and then you teach her how to use both limbs to hold the ball. Consider the following. Access. How will the athlete access the facility, the shower, toilet, etc.? Teammates can be used or wooden ramp. So we're talking about in the event that you have a mixed team, so you could always assign a buddy system so that everybody gets taken care of. And the facility has to have an access point for all types of disabilities, which is why now you find a lot of places have wheelchair ramps. Communication. What is nature? What is the nature and level of communication needed? Player to coach, player to official, player to player. What does anybody think that question is asking?
Okay, so the question that's being asked is, how do we adapt essentially the nature of our communication for athletes with disabilities? Is that correct, Shammah?
Yes, please.
Okay. So to the group, what are some ways that we can adapt or need to adapt our communication based on the group? Go ahead, John. Got your hand up there. So I think communication, especially with athletes with disabilities, needs to be adapted, based on what their level of being able to hear or listen is, as well as just their general, what is their general nature? Are they a quiet person, or is there generally a lot of energy, and whether it's associated with the disability or not? And that may dictate the volume, the positioning of the coach when it talks to those players or people involved. So I think everyone's on a normal situation has differences there, but certainly once you put in either hearing disabilities, which is more physical, or if it's more of a psychological disability, definitely means we have to work with them in all aspects differently.
Brilliant.
All right.
More consideration. Mobility. How the athlete gets around will determine the nature of the experience designed. The coach must consider the level of coordination, balance, etc. Why why do you think mobility is one of the things that we need to take into consideration?
All right, I'll take that. George, you got a comment there? Yeah, so I mean, mobility is key because it's going to affect, your whole environment that you're in. So if you're on a certain type of court, then you have wheelchair athletes. You have to look for hazards within the court, make sure, one, that they can get on the court, two, that when they're on the court, there's no kind of pieces out of place that might hinder their ability to move effectively. So that's just one example. But even so how they can actually enter the arena, how they can perform on different surfaces. I think those things, that's all tied to the mobility and how that affects even just the setting and environment that you're in.
Was that George?
That was George. Yep.
Okay. What about the way your session goes? How much time is affected? Well, something that you should consider in mobility also deals with how much time you have in your session, because you also have to include it based on how much time the athlete's going to take to get around to get the drill done, how much time they're going to take to get off the field. So that also affects the way you plan your training schedule.
Yeah, and I guess this is still George, but I guess that affects too, like just what's their learning curve and what's the complexity of the skills that you're trying to instruct on. Again, with any even like normal athletes, we have to look at that carefully and assess our athletes and how quickly can we meet the objectives of our lesson plan, what we had on paper and plans, to what's the reality right in front of us based on things like mobility. That's one aspect of it. So I guess that would have a pretty big impact on what a lesson plan might be for a different type of athlete.
Okay. Well said. Adaptation. The ability of the coach to adapt the equipment, facility, rules of the game will determine the overall effectiveness of the program. Adaptation. If you have someone with a disability joining your session, what is one way that you could adapt a tag game, a game of tag?
All right, so you're playing a tag game, is that right, Shammah?
Please.
Okay, so coaches, how would we adapt maybe again a game of tag? And that might be maybe a warm-up drill or warm-up game, if you will. But we have one athlete in our group that has a disability, so probably some kind of physical disability with more limited mobility. What are some ways that we could make adaptations there? All right, John, go ahead. So I think we could maybe partner them up with someone who maybe partner everybody up into pairs. And that way it kind of provides a bit more balance within the game itself, as well as supporting that athlete who maybe has a slight mobility challenge or cognitive challenge with the game. And that also may just provide even another barrier of safety as well, having someone that they can hold on to, someone they can move with. And when everybody's on that same page, I think it requires everybody to be that much more aware as well, while still having an enjoyable drill or exercise.
That's very well said. I don't even think I need to say anything more. Additional details you can check with Paralympic.org. And we're at the summary. Persons with disabilities deserve equal opportunities for the realization of benefits. Pay attention to treating them as athletes. Treat them with respect. Talk to them directly. Work with them to find out limitations. Work with them to adapt sports activities, ensure they are physical, ensure they have physical access to sport or recreational facilities.
All right, great. So, with that summary, that brings us towards the end of our session module 9, sport for persons with a disability. The last section here, in terms of our workbook for 9C, which is on page 24, it asks us to list ways to modify activities or drills to accommodate an athlete with disability. We touched upon one example of this, a tag game. So as you go through this, you can look at your own. It'd be helpful, especially look at your own specific sports and think about, if you haven't had that experience before of having an athlete with a disability come in, how would you modify and adapt the drills and activities within your sport? So for 9C here, let's put down some great recommendations. We consider the rules. What's some of the equipment that might need to be modified? The court, maybe a bigger court or a smaller court, or what's the venue look like, and how can that be adapted based on the situation? Is there any way to bring extra assistance in, or have role switching within the games that balances out some of the mobility and competitive aspects of an activity or a drill? Some examples we talked about earlier, in terms of, I think, cricket, and I've seen it with tennis as well, is, if there's balls involved, can there be a bell or a sound device with our equipment to help guide people with any hearing impairments, or visual impairments, excuse me. So there's a few ideas there. So take some time with 9C, first take a shot within your own sport, to think about all the different creative ways that coaches could adapt. And that's what we're really looking for, is some deep thought on 9C as to how you could, and some context as to how you could modify your drills and activities based on a student or an athlete with a disability coming in. So I don't see any other questions right now. So with that, I would like to thank Ms. Philgence, Shammah Philgence, for leading us in this discussion tonight. If you have any other questions, you can reach out to myself. You have my contact information at the Olympic Committee. We'll expect to have these modules submitted before the start of the next session, which should be session 10 on event planning, module 10. If you have any questions in the meantime, reach out. Again, I'd like to thank Ms. Philgence, and we will look forward to seeing you guys at the next module.